So this evening I'd like to talk about the problem of how to explain machine learning decisions. The background is that the newer types of machine learning systems are very complex when compared to more traditional forms of machine learning. So traditional methods, many of you will be familiar with these, were those that largely originated in statistics. You might be familiar with them, linear regression, decision trees, statistical tables and lists of various kinds. The point is these were generally relatively easy to understand. If you had an input, say like the height of a person, and you wanted to predict the person's weight, you could use some of these traditional machine learning techniques to do just that. And it was fairly easy to see how a person's height related to their weight. And that meant that you could understand the basis of the prediction. So if you think of inputs and outputs like this, it's that middle box, the process by which you get inputs from outputs, that was relatively easy to understand and considered transparent. Now, the new generation of machine learning systems aren't quite as easy to unpick. They're called deep neural networks, as again, many of you will know, and they have a number of features that make them difficult to explain. Essentially, they take many hundreds or even thousands of inputs, and that middle processing stage is potentially far more difficult to unravel. They've been called black boxes because, unlike with the earlier or traditional methods, it's difficult to trace the passage of an input on its way to becoming an output. And this opacity is rightly considered problematic for a variety of reasons. But the main one is that these systems are used as decision tools. They're not just supporting, they're increasingly supplanting human decision makers in all sorts of areas. So we're not just using them to predict a person's weight from their height. We're using them to determine what someone's risk of reoffending, for example, might be after serving time in prison, where we should be deploying police patrols in a community, whether to grant someone a loan, whether someone is entitled to welfare, all of these sorts of decisions. Now, these decisions obviously still involve predictions, but the predictions are now informing more ethically consequential and high stakes decision making. So we've got to be able to justify these decisions to the people affected by them. Thus enters the explainable AI movement, which is the attempt to render these advanced machine learning systems more transparent. So that's just all by way of background. One point that's really worth bearing in mind amid all of this is historical. The epistemic situation in which we find ourselves with respect to these systems is not unprecedented. We've been here before. So the first wave of opaque machine learning systems actually broke in the 1980s with the rise of connectionist networks, which in essence were just less advanced versions of the deep networks causing concern today. And it's not as if no one recognized the black box problem or that it was just swept under the rug. A litany of high-profile philosophers and cognitive and computer scientists weighed in on the problem. So Maggie Bowden, Patricia Churchland, Hubert Dreyfus, Andy Clark, these people all turned their attention to this problem of how do we explain these connectionist networks. And what they had to say back then is still instructive for us today. So part of what I'm doing here is really placing the current debate over explainable AI in a context that has rich philosophical heritage. Nevertheless, there definitely are differences. So back in the 1980s, the networks were being used predominantly as a way of understanding the human mind. So connectionist networks were part of the endeavour of understanding human cognition and the way the human mind processed information. The idea being that if you could reproduce an intelligent behavior in a network, so get it to translate German sentences into Italian sentences, well, then you might have better luck in explaining that behavior, because it should be easier to explain a network that can do these intelligent things than it would be to explain a human brain. And while that sort of research still continues, it's safe to say that the neural networks that are raising ethical concerns today aren't necessarily being used to shed light on the human mind. So, as I've already said, they're being used as tools for guiding action, for example, to help with lending decisions, law enforcement, medical diagnoses, and so on. And that necessarily affects the nature of the explanation that we're looking for. Suddenly, you're no longer, as you were in the 1980s, you're no longer trying to explain the system in the hope of illuminating deep properties of the human mind. Instead, you're explaining the system with a view to evaluating action, justifying decisions to those people that are affected by them. And this is a lot closer to the kind of explanation that you'd seek from a teacher who gave you a mark that you didn't approve of, or from a friend who stood you up. In such cases, these sort of interpersonal cases, you're obviously not interested in information about how their brains work or what their vitamin D levels are like, even if, in some sense, knowing that would help explain their action. The big question is, what are you interested in? Just how do you justify action? What sort of information do we want in these interpersonal contexts? So the question we're asking in somewhat more precise terms is, what are the formal prerequisites of justifying explanations? The conditions under which the conditions which all explanations of decisions would have to have, regardless of the domain, to enable someone to say, yes, that's a good decision, or no, that's a bad decision. What's the minimum that a reviewer of a decision, an observer of an action, what's the minimum they require to make an assessment of good or bad? Now, in the machine learning community, there's considerable uncertainty around this. Just how deep or exhaustive must an explanation be to meet the requirements of justification? And one influential view says that even if you can't give, say, a prisoner or a loan applicant a complete technical rundown of why a machine decided the way it did, still, on this view, we should have such detailed explanations. We should still have them as a matter of full disclosure and proper justification. But I take a different view. I think that while it is good to have as much information as you can about an automated decision, it's not usually necessary to have very much information in order to justify a decision. So there might be other reasons why you'd want deeper, more exhaustive explanations from a system, perhaps in order to enhance your control over that system or to improve the system's functioning. But as far as the aims of justification are concerned, the requirements for justifying a decision, it's not usually necessary to have very much information. And I take my cue here from practical reason. So when you look at explanations of human action across any number of domains, what do you find? I think what you find is that explanation proceeds largely via folk psychology. So, for instance, this is where the units of analysis are items like beliefs and desires. And this is certainly true informal interpersonal contexts, the kind that I was mentioning before about when you ask your teacher, why did you give me the mark you gave me? But it's also true in official and high stakes decision making. So here's a toy example. A local council, for example, might say, the council has, it might explain itself in the following way. The council has resolved to ban the construction of buildings beyond a height of 3 stories on High Street. The council believes that this is necessary to preserve the amenity of recreational facilities which it wishes to safeguard. Now you can see here how beliefs and desires are framing the explanation. And so here's another example from criminal justice. Offender X was given a lenient sentence because the judge believed X was remorseful and the judge wanted X to rehabilitate. So that's another example. These and a host of other illustrations that I could give from real court decisions all the way through to the decisions of central banks on interest rates, for example. They all provide a clue to the features of an explanation that I think are doing much of the justificatory work. So I argue in particular that 2 features of these sorts of belief desire explanations are usually jointly sufficient to enable someone to assess an action's merits. And by that I mean, again, that if you can get these 2 features to characterize your machine learning explanation, you can save yourself the trouble of having to seek much more extensive, exhaustive explanations, at least in most cases. Not always, but in most cases. So the 2 features are intentional structure, okay, and here obviously belief desire formulation would be the paradigm. If you can couch an explanation in terms of the beliefs and the desires of the system, then you're on your way. And the second ingredient is behavior tracking, a certain behavior tracking feature, meaning that we should be able to track the agent's behavior via the explanation offered. So very quickly, by intentional structure, I mean, I said that I mean beliefs and desires. They don't have to be beliefs and desires, but this is generally the way it's put. And what that does, intentional structure confers a certain compression, a certain brevity of form. And this ensures a maximum information with least cognitive effort. So it reduces the explanandum to cognitively manageable proportions. And that's the key to truly understanding what an agent is doing and understanding why an action was taken. It makes the explanation interpretable. It allows the explainer to level with the explainee as a fellow agent. The next feature, behavior tracking, well, this is important because it facilitates accurate predictions of an agent's behavior from a set of inputs. So the idea is that we should be able to tell in advance what a system is likely to do when presented with a set of inputs. So these 2 features are my answer to the question of what's required for justifications of machine learning decisions, which is all very well, but the obvious question then becomes, okay, how do you get intentionally structured, interpretable explanations from machine learning systems? That would, after all, amount to treating machines, which are built artifacts, as having something like beliefs and desires. Well, how does that work? So there are 2 issues here. So the first issue is, in what sense can we treat neural networks as having beliefs and desires? And then a second issue is, how can you then extract a network's beliefs and desires? That is, how do you figure out what they actually are? Now, on that first issue, I won't go into the details, but I will note that I use the philosopher Daniel Dennett's intentional systems theory to get that project off the ground. The idea in Dennett's theory is that if you can successfully predict a system's behavior on the assumption that it has beliefs and desires, then you can simply say it has those beliefs and desires. It's not a literal ascription of belief and desire, it's a functional ascription. In other words, ascribing belief desire states to an artifact can be coherent if that ascription gives you predictive leverage. And I think that it does. But I don't have time to explain why I think that's true. On the second issue, how do you extract beliefs? This is a more technical question than a purely philosophical question. But there is a philosophical component to it. And the philosophical component of this question is, what is being extracted? What are the beliefs of a neural network? Well, at least for supervised machine learning systems, the beliefs amount to things like its learned generalizations acquired during training, and these are represented implicitly in patterns of synaptic weights. So for a tool that predicts the risk of reoffending, the risk that someone might reoffend, the beliefs might be rules like this. Now, I note these are pretty crude, but they give you an idea of how a machine might reason. If the person behaved well, then they're a low risk. Otherwise, else high risk. If the number of previous, say, offences or the number of previous arrests is higher than a certain amount, n, then they're high risk, else low risk. Again, crude, but it gives you an example of the kind of generalizations and hence the kind of beliefs that a neural network would have. This is what is being extracted. This is the nature of the beliefs that we can attribute. And the idea is that by assuming that a system has these beliefs, it becomes far easier to predict what it will do given certain inputs. If you have a person presenting that has behaved well and who has only a few previous, well, maybe no previous convictions or previous arrests, then it's safe to assume that this machine learning system will predict that that individual will have a low risk of reoffending. And this is a much easier way to understand and to predict what the system will do. If what I've been saying is right, then it's just these sorts of associations, these sorts of generalizations that make the job of predicting what the tool, the machine learning tool, will do much easier, so that we can build. So these, therefore, are the kinds of explanations we should be extracting so that we can build good, intentional, interpretable explanations that are predictably cogent. Now, as it happens, I think you can understand many so-called post hoc explanation methods in the machine learning community in roughly this way. Again, I don't have time to go into them, but there are various techniques that you may be familiar with. Generally speaking, they're called attribution or feature-based explanation methods. And there are a number of different kinds. The two broad families are gradient-based methods on the one hand and perturbation-based methods. Suffice to say that if I just focus on, say, perturbation-based explanation methods, the idea is that what you're doing is you're focusing on specific regions of the input space, fiddling with them and seeing what effect that has on the machine's prediction. And in so doing, you're trying to home in on what input it is that is most determinative, most influencing the prediction. And by doing that, you hope to arrive at a kind of catalogue of generalizations, such as the ones that are on the screen. Techniques that I could mention here include sensitivity analysis, saliency mapping, various visualization methods. Another one is, some of you might be familiar with, of course, is LIME, L-I-M-E. All of these, I think, are essentially best understood as methods of belief extraction. So that's essentially the nuts and bolts of an argument that I have been making in the philosophy of explanation of AI systems. And what I've done today, just to very quickly recap, is present two formal criteria of explanations of action that I think are jointly sufficient in most cases to be able to enable a third-party observer of a tool, of a machine learning agent, to assess whether the action is justified or not. It doesn't tell you, I'm not giving essentially the ingredients for good decision-making. I'm merely providing the ingredients, the formal criteria of the bare minimum that an agent has to give in order to enable the observer to judge for themselves whether the action, the decision, is justified. Obviously, the observer cannot be, is not in a position to make that judgment unless they have understanding of the norms of that particular domain in question. You cannot judge a chess move unless you know something about the norms of good, competent chess playing. You cannot judge a legal decision unless you understand the law and you understand the norms of, say, judicial discretion. However, what is the minimum that the explainer has to give you as the assessor of that decision? The very minimum they have to give you are the two formal criteria that I indicate, and that's enough then for the observer to make a judgment about whether the decision is good or bad, provided the assessor obviously has internalized the norms of the domain in question. So I'm not dealing with substantive criteria of justification. I'm dealing with formal criteria. So that's the talk.